communication morality, media use, and vaccine psychology, testing an M-SOR model in India and the US. This presentation has been prepared for the 2023 annual conference of International Communication Association, which is held in Toronto, Canada. We are the two authors, Weiyu, speaking here from National University of Singapore. The second author, Dr. Chen Zhuo, now works at Peking University Hengsheng Business School as an assistant professor. So both of us want to first extend our sincere appreciation to a team who has been working with us during the pandemic on the computational analysis of vaccine issues. So without this team, this project would not have been started. Although we now completed, we want to thank all of them for their generous support. We also want to acknowledge the generous financial support from our grantor, National University of Singapore, through a civic technology project. All right, so here is a plan for our presentation today. First, we want to talk about why we are motivated to do a study like this. Well, basically, when we were deep in the pandemic, towards the later half of COVID-19, vaccine has been a very hotly debated issue. COVID vaccine in particular, seems to be the only solution to the problem to save all the humankind from the disaster. Vaccine has been developed rapidly around the world. Some countries like the US government has given up the copyrights of their vaccines so the whole world can produce their own vaccine and benefit their populations. However, during this process, there were also voices that resist the COVID vaccine, questioning the benefits and the potential risks of COVID vaccines. Well, vaccine resistance is not a new issue for health communication scholars. Before COVID-19 vaccines, there are also many other vaccines that have been resisted. The vaccine resistance study has taken so far focus or emphasizes misinformation and the reinforcing effect between misinformation and misperception. So, whereas trying to incorporate the misinformation perspective in our study takes a different perspective or framework, which focus on the moral roots of vaccine resistance. So basically, what's the difference between the two perspectives? Well, if you take the misinformation perspective, they would think that the question is about what is true or false about vaccine effects. However, if you take the moral perspective or framework, the question you ask becomes what is right or wrong about taking vaccines. So maybe vaccines don't have all these side effects misinformation tries to say. However, I simply feel that this is not the right thing I should do if I take the vaccines, right? What do we mean by specifically a morality framework? Well, the morality framework comes from the classic theory called moral foundation theory. This moral foundation theory basically says there are 5 fundamental moral values shared by all human beings. So they are care, harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, or purity, right? Well, if you look at the communication scholarship, moral factors have already been examined by communication scholars. It often appears as 2 kinds of factors. First, as a media feature. Basically, media messages, right, like entertainment TV, may contain certain kind of moral values. So existing scholarship tries to see how these moral messages influence children, influence entertainment consumers, and influence basically their judgments and actions. Other than that, moral factors have also been studied as if they are psychological features. At the individual level, studies have looked at individuals' moral beliefs and how these moral beliefs lead to different kinds of other attitudes and reactions. There's this interesting concept called moral subculture, which look at moral factors as if they are group psychology. So people who share similar priorities in certain kind of moral values would form into a group. This group may act in certain ways different from other groups, right? So this is called moral subcultures. Being inspired by these existing literatures, this study really wants to conduct a cross-cultural analysis of basically the relationship between moral foundations and media usage and vesting psychology. When it comes to the theoretical framework we're going to implement in the study, we learned from two existing theoretical models, right? The first one is called M-SOR, which is very well known. We also consulted another theoretical model called MIME. MIME is basically based on moral foundation theory and look at morality as one of the fundamental dispositions. So in this M-SOR model, morality is implemented as the first O, or the first orientation in M-SOR. Then we reason that morality would somehow influence the stimuli, basically the media usage, right? Then the media usage will further influence people's attitudes towards the vesting, which is second orientation, being influenced by being exposed to the media usage. Lastly, we will look at reactions, basically the vesting intentions people have. So our first RQ really focused on the rather novel part of this M-SOR model. How are moral foundations related to the usage of media? So we want to test this new theoretical model in different cultural contexts. It is because that moral foundation theory has argued that there will be some kind of cultural differences in terms of moral patterns. There are existing studies that provide some empirical evidences supporting these cultural differences. For instance, there are studies showing that the Eastern cultures seem to have higher amount of binding morality among their populations compared to the Western cultures. Our study wants to take a step further to go beyond so-called the distribution differences. We want to look at the differences in terms of the way how different moralities influence other things, such as vesting psychology, such as media usage. All right, the two cultural contexts we chose were India and the US. As we know, both are big countries in terms of size and population, but both are also very different culturally. Like India is a typical example of Eastern culture, the US a Western culture. So we want to ask, what are the consistencies and differences in the two cultures regarding the impacts of moral foundations on a bunch of variables? So method-wise, we did an M-Turk study because M-Turk is pretty popular in both countries. We know that both countries are huge, so we could not really get a nationally representative sample from M-Turk. What we did was to try our best to sample based on the quota derived from national populations. However, as you can imagine, we still ended up with more or higher representation from the younger users, such as those who aged from 21 to 40 years old. So in both surveys, we asked identical survey questions. People were asked about vesting, intention, knowledge, belief in misinformation. They were also asked about media usage. We had very generic categorization of media use into traditional media use like paper newspapers, online information use such as news websites, online interactive use including social networking sites. We also asked about their moral menus. Later on, we combined these 5 moral foundations into 2 categories, the binding ones and the individualizing ones. After getting our data, we ran structural equation modeling on both samples, and after getting a satisfactory model fit, we continued to look at the country differences. Right. So the SEM based on the 2 samples show some differences in terms of coefficients and significance levels. However, we're not sure whether they are statistically different from each other, right? So we ran an additional step of multiple group analysis to identify those country differences that are statistically meaningful. All right, so what do we find? Well, as you can imagine, we find both common ground or similarities across 2 countries as well as differences. So common study across the 2 countries is basically a positive effect of binding morality. We found that those who have stronger binding morality, they tend to use all kinds of media, including traditional online informational and online interactive media. Basically, those who care about the groups and the communities will use media more to understand people or things going around them. However, the same variable, binding morality, also shows some worrying effects. Basically, binding morality is positively related to belief in misinformation. Those who have stronger binding morality tend to believe more in misinformation. We also found that online interactive media is positively related to misinformation belief. The more you use online interactive media like social network sites, the more likely the individuals believe in the misinformation. This is also a worrying effect. It shows how much misinformation is going on in social network sites, so that those who use these interactive media more are more likely to be exposed to this information, thus believe in this information. How about some of the nuanced differences? Well, we first find that individualizing morality is negatively related to use of traditional media in India. Think that this is because Indian media ecosystem is very different from the US one. India is a large country. Many parts of the country have their own language, their own religions, their own local politics and culture. The traditional media scene is very fragmented, with large national traditional media, but as well as a lot more vernacular, smaller local traditional media, such as newspapers. We suspect that it's because these traditional media tend to emphasize the so-called traditional Eastern values that focus on binding moralities. So those who embrace individualizing moralities finds these traditional media to be too far away from their moral preferences, so they avoided these traditional media. We also find that vesting knowledge is positively related to vesting intention in India only. We suspect that it's because in India, you will still find larger variances in terms of knowing vestings. And whereas in the US, we can imagine that maybe the knowledge level is relatively similar across different parts of the society. Lastly, we find use of traditional media positively related to vesting intention in the US. This is also a very interesting finding. We would like to hear from you what you think about this finding. Lastly, a few conclusions we want to draw from this study. The first conclusion we draw is morality is confirmed again as a very fundamental disposition. So this disposition not only influences how people respond to media messages, it also has this fundamental influence on which channels they are going to turn to for information. So before we can convince or persuade people with messages, we need to understand how their moralities would influence their choices of media channels, so we can decide which channels we should use to broadcast these messages in order to convince our users. Well, our second conclusion is a question we hope that we can further answer. Basically, what can we do about the negative effects of a positive thing? Binding morality has been believed to be a good thing to have, right? Because people who have higher binding morality would tend to care about others, the community, and the group, basically things beyond the individual. However, we also found that binding morality tends to be positively related to misinformation belief. It's probably because these people who care about other people believe the misinformation, such as side effects of vaccines that could impact on vulnerable groups, but not themselves. Lastly, we find that moral foundation theory is right that morality is universally existent. You can find all five moral foundations in different cultures. However, we also support the idea that the impact of morality is provincial, right? So the distribution is there. However, how the morality influence other important things might differ from culture to cultures. All right, we want to end this presentation with some suggestions for future efforts. We definitely need to conduct more comparative studies because this study only includes 2 countries and 2 cultures. We need to expand our cultural comparisons into other more diverse contexts. Second, we also could extend this line of research by looking at how individual morality conditions people's responses to vaccine messages. If certain media messages emphasize, for instance, the care value, would people have prioritized the care value, respond to these messages more positively? Last but not least, I think health communication scholars and moral psychology scholars can definitely work together to look at the moral foundation of health attitudes. There are lots of health attitudes out there, and how the different 5 moral values relate to these health attitudes need to be examined and find out. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.